Good evening. I'm Mike Knetter, and welcome to the UW Now Livestream series, where we bring you experts from the UW community to talk about timely and important topics. We, like the rest of the country, have taken on some pretty weighty topics in recent weeks. So we thought tonight it would be timely and important to focus on some personal growth and development. Our show delves into the related concepts of wisdom and well-being. In the face of all the information overload and a global pandemic, who doesn't need a little more wisdom and well-being right now? Joining me are two internationally renowned faculty members who will each give a short talk, and then we'll go to your audience questions. Jennifer Ratner-Rosenhagen is the Merle Curti and Vilas Borghese Distinguished Achievement Professor of History. Richard Davidson is the William James and Vilas Research Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry and founder and director of the Center for Healthy Minds. Thank you both for joining us tonight. I know everyone's looking forward to hearing your talks and having a chance to ask their questions. Professor Ratner-Rosenhagen will lead us off with her talk on wisdom. As noted, she's the Merle Curti and Vilas Borghese Distinguished Achievement Professor of History. She's an expert in U.S. intellectual and cultural history, and her research and teaching interests include the history of philosophy, political and social theory, religion, literature, and the visual arts, the transatlantic flow of intellectual and cultural movements, among other topics. She is the author of The Ideas That Made America, A Brief History, and American Nietzsche, A History of an Icon and His Ideas. She was a fellow at Harvard's Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study in 2014 and 15. Jennifer received her BA from the University of Rochester and her PhD from Brandeis University. Jennifer, thanks for joining us this evening. We look forward to your talk and asking some questions when we're done.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you. I really appreciate that nice introduction. So I come to this theme of wisdom as an intellectual historian of the United States, which means that I study American history through the lens of ideas and intellectual movements. One particular idea that has long captured my attention is wisdom. I'm interested in how Americans over the course of the 20th century up until today have understood wisdom, why they craved it, and how they sought to use it either to remake themselves or to remake American society, or even make changes in the wider world. So I realize that in our current violent, volatile, fractious moment, on the eve of an uncertain transfer of political power, during a global pandemic that has claimed over 2 million lives thus far, and with the world still lurching toward irreparable climate catastrophe, the word wisdom may seem a little bit jarring or romantic or escapist or frankly even downright silly. Wisdom carries traces of something antiquated, sentimental, hokey, airy-fairy, or simply too impossible to articulate and even harder to achieve. However, for generations of serious-minded American thinkers, writers, activists, spiritual seekers, wisdom was in no way romantic, it was not quietist, nor was it escapist. Nor did they believe that wisdom was outsized by the most pressing social, political, and existential issues of their day, whether that was belligerent nationalism, whether that was authoritarianism, racism and inequality, genocide, hot wars, cold wars, or even environmental devastation. Quite the contrary, many wisdom seekers over the past 100+ years believed that, in fact, it was the absence of wisdom which caused those ills in the first place, and that it was their work to try to retrieve either lost wisdom or forgotten wisdom or ignored wisdom to try to ameliorate these ills in American life. In just a little bit, you'll be hearing from Richard Davidson, who's the William James Chair in Psychology and Psychiatry, and he's going to be talking about mindfulness and well-being and its relationship to wisdom. So I mention Richie Davidson here actually so that I can sneak in a reference to the name of his chair, which is this chair is for William James. And for those of you who aren't familiar with William James, James was a towering figure in the history of American thought, in more broadly, but also history of wisdom seeking in particular. James was a prominent psychologist and philosopher. In fact, he's really one of the founders of psychology in the United States, as well as the prime force behind pragmatism, which was a philosophical movement that got started in the late 19th century. And if you look at the kind of whole corpus of James's work, you can see that he was really devoted to helping people at the turn of the last century dealing with the imposing challenges that were posed by a dramatically transforming society. So James was one of the first modern observers to recognize that science and technology were making clear advancements in Americans' lives, but they weren't necessarily making Americans more wise. And so James sought to use the tools of modern science to reconceive of wisdom in a way that would make its value for modern life unmistakable. He understood that in a rapidly diversifying, modernizing America, wisdom could no longer be grounded in or justified by dogma or intellectual provincialism or religious certainties. And so he sought a kind of wisdom that could resonate with tough-minded scientists, while at the same time capturing the hearts and the minds of a diversifying modern society. So the way that I like to put it is that James sought a wisdom that could stand at the bar of the modern mind. James dies in 1910, but his influence and ideas and the example of his own life carries on with generations and generations of diverse figures trying similarly to come to terms with wisdom and trying to figure out how they can use it as an antidote for a world that was out of whack. Okay, so I think you all know a little something about a world out of whack, and so maybe some of you, like James, are curious about what wisdom has been missing in our world and what might we try to do to bring it to life. But that, of course, begs the question, what is wisdom? What is wisdom? So I'm quite sure that some of you are tuning in this evening because you'd like to know what it is. And so I won't be too coy. I won't be too withholding. But I do feel the need to say this, and that is my interest in wisdom is as a historian, and my expertise is as a historian. So my speaking tonight on wisdom, I don't come as a philosopher. I don't have my own philosophy of wisdom. I have absolutely no credentials for self-help, for therapy. I'm not a spiritual leader. I'm not a guru. But I am interested in wisdom, the ideas about it, how people sought it in their own lives in a historical perspective. And it turns out that adopting a historical perspective, I think, does have some wisdom of its own. Not the least of which is that by looking at ideas about and different quests for and iterations of wisdom over the time frame of history, you can start to see certain commonalities over time and over space. Some that are really quite mind-blowing because they even break down distinctions between religious traditions or philosophical commitments or even intellectual temperaments and habits of mind. Okay, so what I want to do now is just draw on just a handful of those key features. There's many, but I don't want to overstay my welcome, and we can of course talk about it in the Q&A. So I'm just going to pull out a few of those resonant, reoccurring notions of wisdom. And one way that I could do it, one way that I'm very comfortable doing it, is by, in fact, bringing in some of those wisdom figures in the past who are part of this history. And that's a very comfortable pose for me as an intellectual historian. What drew me to the field of intellectual history is that I could spend my days in the company of conversations with people like Albert Einstein or Mahatma Gandhi or Rachel Carson or any other wisdom figure. But I thought that after such a rough 2020 and such a rough start to 2021, that it might be reassuring to actually invite into this conversation people who are still alive, and indeed people who are part of the younger generation, so that we might get a sense that wisdom, the quest for it, the longing for it, ideas about it, the efforts to instantiate it in our lives isn't just retrospective. This is not a quaint artifact of a bygone era, but in fact is something that is a lived longing, lived reality among the younger generation. And so the younger generation I have in mind are some UW students right here in our midst. So if you could go to the first slide, I will introduce you to the first student who is going to be signposting us to wisdom. So this is a slide of Zeta Ballou, who is a graduate student in US history, and she's specializing in Native American history and North American history. So Zeta shared with me her notions of wisdom, and she thought about them appropriately in the context of her immediate experience, which is as a teacher and as a student. And so what we can see is that Zeta's thinking about undergraduate instruction in particular, and she shares that when you take the perspective that we're in this together and we're here to learn from one another, there's the false belief that the teacher is the only person who is doing the teaching and the students are the only one doing the learning. This melts away. And for Zeta, this is incredibly promising because it means that there's shared wisdom. Yeah, wisdom is not unidirectional, it's not unilateral, but it's reciprocal, it's dialogic. And this is what Zeta's pointing out here, I want to stress, isn't just particular to the classroom. This is actually, she's touching on something that is a very common theme in this wisdom discourse. And that is the notion that we learn from others and that wisdom is experienced, explored, understood in a dialogic and reciprocal way. There's another thing that I think is interesting right here. It's subtle in her quotation. In the longer material that she shared with me, it's very, very clear. And that is she's teasing out also a Jamesian notion of wisdom here. And that is by noting that wisdom isn't linked to one's status or station in society. In other words, you can be a student and have wisdom. You don't have to be a teacher to have wisdom. She's pointing us in a direction of an insight that James had, where James argued that it doesn't matter where a wisdom claim comes from. That is to say, an idea about wisdom, a notion of wisdom, doesn't have its authority based on who says it, whether it's your priest or your professor or your political leader. That is to say, the origins of a wisdom claim are not necessarily so important. What's important is where that wisdom claim takes you. It's the consequences of that claim. It's how that idea shows up in your life. And so here we have Zeta quite effortlessly showing us several important elements that we see in the wisdom discourse time and time again. The notion of reciprocity, of dialogue, of pluralistic perspectives, and the notion that truth value has to manifest itself in our lives. Also the important notion that no one person, no one position has a lock on wisdom. Okay, so what are some other features of wisdom? Let's follow Zeta's gentle direction and listen to what some other students have to say. So let's pull up the next slide, and here you will be introduced to Austin Barrett, who is a sophomore majoring in comm arts. And Austin is a terrific student. I had him in a class last semester, and he had a lot of thoughts about wisdom, one of which was what do we have excerpt here, which is that when he thinks of wisdom, he thinks of it personified as a grandfather in a rocking chair with kids at his feet. And I can imagine that maybe some of you are thinking like, that's kind of, that sounds a little trite, or it's a little hackneyed, grandmother, grandfather source of wisdom. Actually, if you, I couldn't put too much quote on a text, but the longer writing that Austin did was quite funny. But it's actually quite right, or that is to say, quite insightful. And that is what Austin is touching on here is something I have seen time and time again. And the notion that is that wisdom is not expressed in theoretical concepts, but rather it is lived through actual human beings. So whether that's Buddha or Confucius or Jesus or Henry David Thoreau or Leo Tolstoy or Mother Teresa or Toni Morrison or even someone's grandpa in a rocking chair, these wisdom figures are understood as exemplars of wisdom, that wisdom is not a body of knowledge, but rather it's a particular type of knowing that is embodied in real human beings thinking and doing and being. And here I just want to put a little sticky note here. When I started this research, and for quite some time, I assumed that when we thought about wisdom as being personified or exemplified in particular people, it was that we would hear that wisdom is something that they're passing on, that they're bequeathing to the next generation, or to students, or to seekers. So the idea of wisdom is something that one could inherit, but actually, what I see time and time again is that the attraction to, or the resonance of wisdom as something that's embodied in particular people is not that they teach by passing along their wisdom, but rather by exemplifying it. In other words, wisdom is learned by example, not by inheritance. And that is something that is very striking to me. Okay, so a firm and fast definition of wisdom is hard to come by, in large part because the most common definitions of wisdom is that it's nearly impossible to define. A common way of characterizing wisdom is that it's ineffable, indefinable, mysterious. These were not admissions, though, of intellectual failure, but rather they were strong affirmations of a virtue to be cultivated. That is to say, saying that wisdom is ineffable, indefinable, is actually linked to a virtue in this discourse, and that is the notion of epistemic humility, the recognition of the imperfections of human cognition. So in this wisdom discourse, this epistemic humility, this emphasis on the limits of the human mind, is valued largely because of its ripple effects on the human heart. The awareness that our minds are unable to capture the whole of truth can foster reflection, introspection, contemplation, and careful attention of others around us, of the world around us. So that is to say, epistemic humility, the notion that our cognition is limited, actually can lead, is actually also a moral claim. Here we can go to the next slide, and it may seem odd to pull up a slide by James Meadows, also a graduate student in history and ed policy study, where he says, for me, wisdom means seeing clearly that which is commonly obscured. So that may seem a little dissonant. How can epistemic humility allow you to see what is commonly obscured? But actually, what we see time and time again in this discourse is the notion that the awareness of one's own bounded field for understanding actually can open a space for discernment about the scope and the relations of things as they are. So I'll go to the next slide, but I want to keep it short because I want to keep an eye on the time here. And I just want to introduce you to Rachel Seablum, who is also a graduate student in history, as well as a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. And I'm going to move ahead in the interest of time, but Rachel, I think, is very interesting in for our conversation today as a member of the military, where because she has particular notions about what that might look like in the what might wisdom look like in the context of the military, and she actually sees interesting connections between that and being a historian. And I'll just say for her, the key word is context. So you can have rules, you can have regulations, but you need the ability to see things in context. As she puts it, it's a quote unquote way of thinking that requires flexibility, curiosity, openness to novelty, to think beyond a set of rules and codes. And so she makes this point that computers can think in rules and codes, but wisdom is something that human beings have. So at least for now, I think you cannot code for wisdom. That's I think Rachel's hope and certainly mine. Okay, let me turn to the last slide, and this is to wrap up for the last point that I would make about aspects of or ideas about wisdom that we see cropping up again and again throughout history. What are ideas about wisdom? And one of them is the notion of wisdom is as a practice. So this seems like a logical place to transition to Richie Davidson, because he is one of the foremost leaders and scholars on mindfulness as a practice. So commentators have always agreed that wisdom is not something that could be set on a shelf in a leather-bound volume or placed under domed glass for inspection and display, but rather wisdom is something that one does as a spiritual exercise, and some even refer to it unglamorously and even unapologetically as a habit, wisdom as a habit. And I pull up this quote from Jada Beacom because she also understands this notion that this idea of seeing for her practice, and for her practice was what she calls intentional existence. In the larger quote, she talks about learning to do nothing. So at a time when our iPhones and the internet is constantly clamoring for our attention, if you're an achievement junkie, as she referred to herself, the desire to go, 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 but actually practicing nothing, doing nothing, just being present, being intentional, is a wisdom practice that she's learned actually this year during the pandemic. And again, this is something we see again and again, the emphasis on practice, whether it's creating solitude, focusing on the present moment, opening awareness, observing thoughts, nourishing empathy. You see over and over again this notion that wisdom is not something, it's not an achievement, it's not an accomplishment, it's a ritual practice, it's an exercise, it's a process. There's no one and done with wisdom. So on that, I'm going to pivot to actually Mike, who is going to introduce Richie Davidson. And I think Richie will have a lot more to say about wisdom as a practice and also a path to well-being. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer, for getting us rolling. That was very interesting, and I'm sure we're going to have a lot of great questions. And I'm only slightly disappointed we don't have wisdom in 3 bullet points, but I think I get it. Next, we have Professor Richie Davidson, the William James and Vilas Research Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry and the founder and director of the Center for Healthy Minds. His research is broadly focused on the neural bases of emotion and emotional style. He studies methods to promote human flourishing, including meditation and related contemplative practices, and frequently collaborates with the Dalai Lama on this work. He's published more than 440 articles, numerous chapters and reviews, and edited 14 books. And his books include The Emotional Life of Your Brain and Altered Traits: Science Reveals How Meditation Changes Your Mind, Brain, and Body. Among other awards, he's received the Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award, the most distinguished science award given by the American Psychological Association, and he was also named one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time magazine in 2006. He's a current member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Mental Health, the National Academy of Medicine, and the governing board of UNESCO's Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development. Richie, thanks for coming back to the show. It's very timely for us to have a little moment on well-being and its connection to wisdom, and you are the perfect person to follow Jennifer's wonderful remarks tonight. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Mike, for having me. And it's great to be with all of you this evening. And thank you, Jennifer, for that really wonderful presentation and beautiful segue to the remarks that I will make this evening. Let me begin by simply acknowledging the challenging time in which we all find ourselves. Even pre-pandemic, I think most would agree that the trajectory we've all been on is not a particularly healthy or sustainable one. Data from the pre-pandemic period indicates that the levels of distractibility among people across the globe are extraordinary and rising. The average adult spends 47% of her or his waking life not paying attention to what they're doing. 76% of Americans report themselves to be either moderately or significantly lonely. And loneliness is a more significant risk factor for mortality than obesity, actually more than double the risk factor. There is an epidemic of depression that is occurring. It is now, according to the World Health Organization, the leading cause of morbidity worldwide. The rates of depression in the United States have increased more than 30% over just the last 5 years. And this is affecting not just adults, but our youth as well. Today, there's more than one teenage suicide every single day in the United States. So I don't want to depress all of you with these figures, but I simply want to underscore that we are having a crisis of well-being on the planet that has only been exacerbated by the pandemic. My aspiration is that the pandemic will actually serve as a wake-up call to help us appreciate that we can actually all take more responsibility for our own minds and cultivate well-being to some extent. We know that our well-being is influenced by the forces around us. And most of those forces we have very little control over. In fact, many of those forces are forces of which we're only dimly aware. But the invitation in the message that I'm going to be conveying this evening is that we can actually practice well-being and think about well-being more as a skill than as a inevitable consequence of our lived environment. So this notion of well-being as a skill is a very simple but very radical one. And I'll share a little bit about this in just a few moments. But before I do that, I want to talk about a very important insight that we glean from modern science that is relevant to some of the remarks that Jennifer has made. According to our understanding of how the brain works, there are two fundamentally different kinds of learning. One form of learning we call declarative learning, which is learning about stuff. So we can learn about the value of wisdom. But I think, or we can learn about the value of honesty. We can learn about the value of kindness. And this could be very important, but it won't necessarily make us a wise person. It won't necessarily make us an honest person. It won't necessarily make us a kind person. In order to realize these virtues, as Jennifer was alluding to, and beautifully incorporated William James, one of my intellectual heroes, into this, there's a second form of learning, which is critically important. And that is a form of learning we call procedural learning. Procedural learning is embodied learning. It is based on acquiring skills, and it is acquired through practice. There are certain kinds of learning that are largely procedural. We know, for example, that you cannot learn to play a musical instrument by attending lectures and reading books. you need to also practice. The same is true for well-being. And one aspect of well-being we believe, is very closely connected to wisdom. So I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But let me first introduce a framework for understanding well-being. And this is a framework that we in our center have written a lot about over the last few years and motivates a lot of the work that we do, both in the laboratory as well as in the world. And this framework is a framework that describes 4 key pillars of well-being, each of which exhibits plasticity, each of which can be changed by experience and also modified through training. So what are these 4 pillars? The first pillar we call awareness. And awareness includes our capacity to regulate our attention, something, by the way, William James recognized as a competence that's critically important for humans. A second aspect of awareness is knowing what our minds are doing. That may sound strange to some viewers. Don't we always know what our minds are doing? But how many of you have had the experience of reading a book where you're reading each word on a page and you're reading one page, perhaps a second page, and after a few minutes, you have no idea what you've just read. Your mind is somewhere else. The moment you recognize that is a moment of meta-awareness, knowing what our minds are doing. That is a learnable skill. The second pillar of well-being is connection. Connection is about qualities that promote healthy social relationships, qualities like appreciation, gratitude, empathy, kindness, compassion. We know that all of those qualities are qualities that can be learned, but just as with awareness, they require both declarative and procedural learning in order to actually change those dimensions of well-being. The third pillar of well-being is the one that is most closely connected to wisdom in the contemplative traditions and in scientific research. And this component of well-being we call insight. And insight is a very deep experiential understanding of how our minds actually work, particularly how the narrative that we all have about ourselves influences our experience of the world, how our beliefs and our expectations about the world color and filter our experience. It's not so much about changing these beliefs and expectations. It's about deeply recognizing that these beliefs and expectations and our conception of ourselves plays a very dramatic role in shaping our realities. And if we can appreciate that at a deep experiential level, it is a tremendous source of wisdom. And the quote from James Meadows that Jennifer showed, that wisdom has something to do with making things that were previously obscure more visible, is directly related to this notion of insight. Because a lot of the time we're unaware of how our beliefs and expectations are shaping our reality. And if we can become aware of it and deeply understand it, it can liberate us from being constrained by these beliefs and expectations. So finally, the last pillar of well-being is purpose. And purpose is about identifying our true north in life. And it's not so much about finding new things to do to create a sense of purpose, but rather seeing more and more of what we're already doing as being central to our sense of purpose. And this is something that's particularly, I think, important during this time of the pandemic. Could we see that even mundane activities of daily living, like taking out the garbage and doing your laundry, might be actually related to our sense of purpose? And can we infuse those activities with this sense of meaning? The greater range of activity that we can include within this umbrella of meaning and purpose will enable us to really flourish, to be resilient, and is particularly important at this time. So I want to now just say a little bit about how we can cultivate these qualities and why this is so important for developing our well-being and for expressing positive qualities during these challenging times. One of the key pillars upon which all of this work is based is the recognition that our minds and brains exhibit plasticity. Many of you have probably heard of this word, neuroplasticity. This simply means that our brains can change in response to experience and in response to training. And it's quite remarkable to observe in the laboratory with sophisticated methods to interrogate the function and structure of the human brain, just how plastic our brains really are. Even structurally, literally the wiring patterns in our brains can change after just a couple of hours of practice. Really quite remarkable. And the amazing finding, which has been now repeatedly observed by many different laboratories, is that when we practice well-being, when we cultivate these healthy habits of mind, it turns out that it actually changes our brain. And it changes our brain in ways that are measurable and in ways that enable these qualities to stick, to endure. And the kinds of strategies that we can use to change our brains in this way are strategies which critically depend upon not just declarative learning, but also procedural learning. I loved Jennifer's remarks toward the end of her presentation about how wisdom is something that we learn by example. It's something that is embodied by individuals, and we can osmotically learn that by being in the presence of wise people. That is really something I think so important and illustrates the nature of the kind of learning that it takes to achieve well-being and to exhibit wisdom, which includes, in a very important way, procedural learning. The academy in the West today privileges declarative learning. There are very few courses that formally incorporate procedural learning into the curriculum, with the exception of the arts, where with music, with dance, clearly that is mostly procedural learning. But in the more traditional subjects, procedural learning typically is quite absent. I want to share with you an innovative experiment that we have been doing here at UW-Madison. With my colleagues, we have launched what we call the Student Flourishing Initiative. And we are teaching a course that is designed for college freshmen with no prerequisites, called the Art and Science of Human Flourishing. This course is based upon this framework for understanding well-being. And this course includes both declarative and procedural learning. And in fact, this past semester, we taught this course here at UW-Madison. And because of COVID, it was taught almost exclusively online. And it enabled us to teach the course both synchronously and asynchronously, so that the declarative learning that the students did, they did by watching videos that we created, little TED Talks, and that was declarative, and they watched it before they attended class, which was the synchronous meetings. And in the class periods, we use those periods largely for two purposes. One was for discussion of the material that they read and listened to, the declarative content, but also importantly, to teach them procedural exercises to actually cultivate their well-being, including this quality of wisdom, really deeply understanding how their minds are actually working. And so maybe during the questions and answers, if there is interest, we can actually do a little practice together where we can have a little taste of this. But one of the things that we've been doing as part of this course is actually tracking the students and seeing how they're doing by evaluating them before and after the course on objective metrics of well-being. And one of the other things that we've done is we've been teaching this course now for several years. And we decided this semester, during the COVID era, we would actually go back and find the kids who took the course in previous years, in the 2 previous years, and see how they're adapting to this period of challenge during the pandemic. And we actually observed in research that hasn't been written up yet, but we have just collected these data showing that the students who participated in this course in the past are actually doing significantly better than their peers in response to the pandemic. They have fewer symptoms of anxiety and depression. They are coping more effectively with stress. And amazingly, they also report that they're significantly more likely to comply with public health recommendations of wearing masks when they're in situations that require them. So these are just a few insights into the consequences of cultivating well-being and the impact it may have on our abilities to cope more effectively with the challenges that we face today. So let me end here, and I look forward to our questions, and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Richie. That's a great framework that I think gives us all something to hang on to and maybe start our own practice. And you know, your discussion about the course made me wonder the extent to which maybe, Jennifer, you could share with us a little bit. Is there a connection to the study of wisdom in the academy? And, you know, what has been the relationship of the academy to this construct of wisdom over time? Are there courses on it or centers? And was it more important in the past than it is today? Yeah.
That's a great question. Even though I'm not actually physically at the university right now, we're not very far from it. And that is my spiritual home. So I think a lot about wisdom in the university. I think wisdom, it's very interesting, Mike, because wisdom, you know, if you look more broadly at the whole of American history, in the 18th century, in the 19th century, wisdom was everywhere. I mean, wisdom was one of the key terms of American intellectual life. So, you know, you just couldn't understand any sort of intellectual pursuit without hearing how it was yoked to wisdom, you know, as a kind of pursuit of wisdom. But wisdom lost its intellectual credentials, as it were, in the late 19th and early 20th century with the rise of the modern university, the rise of disciplinary specialization. Wisdom started to seem like something that was kind of quaint and an artifact of, Victorian era or pre-modern era. So the university in the 20th century was the word wisdom crops up in mottos and stuff, but no, there were not a lot of wisdom classes. There were no wisdom research centers, but as you know, wisdom you might know, is sort of big business beyond the academy, right? I mean, there's a huge industry in wisdom books and wisdom literature. And I think what we're seeing, maybe Richie can help me on this, but maybe in the last 10 years, the last 5 years for sure, more and more universities, I think, recognizing that there's an interest here, there's resources here, and so there are some wisdom centers, research centers that have cropped up at a few universities in the United States. I mean, I don't know whether Richie would say your human flourishing class has anything to do with this, but I know that the philosophy now offers a meaning of life class here. Time will tell. That isn't to say that there's no wisdom at the university, but it is to say that I don't think it's not a term of self-description for many, undergrads going off to college that they're seeking wisdom, or professors who understand themselves as dispensing wisdom. And yet, like I said, if you look beyond the academy, there's huge interest in American life, in wisdom.
I guess it's the ultimate interdisciplinary quest.
Yeah, absolutely.
Question from the audience. Lou Blazek wonders about the impact of the rise of social media and what bearing that might have had on the concept of wisdom.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Richie, we could divide and conquer.
Yeah, I've got a lot to say about that, but why don't you go first, Jennifer?
That's true. So, good. It's always a story of good and bad, right? The chiaroscuro of social media. So social media has allowed for a really a much bigger, brisker traffic in wisdom quotations and wisdom ideas and references to wisdom figures. So I think social media has facilitated an exchange, for links to podcasts and links to books and links to meditation. So, I mean, in some ways, it's been a fabulous for kind of the expansion and dissemination and free flow of ideas about wisdom. And then here comes the and yet. What is it that the engagement with social media does to people's ability to hold attention? What the capacity for introspection, as opposed to thinking, waiting for how many likes or thumbs up that they're going to get. I mean, Richie could say much more about social media's impact on our well-being. So, on the one hand, while it's a super, super duper highway of information and wisdom sources, I do, my sense is that participation in social media itself is not necessarily the wisest. It's not necessarily a wisdom practice, but I probably say that more as a worried parent than with any particular expertise.
Yeah, so I very much share those views. One of the important aspects of social media is the masterful hijacking of attention that has been so effective in its reach, and there are certainly all the benefits, which I certainly would agree with, that Jennifer articulated. We have access to information in ways that we never had before, all of which has a lot of benefit. But we need to teach our children skills of attention so that they can be more discerning in their consumption of social media, and rather than having their attention hijacked by social media, they can voluntarily choose which social media to ingest, so to speak. And so this is a serious issue, I think, for our educational systems, and it really begins in preschool. We know that children as young as 4 and 5 years of age can learn to deploy attention more skillfully. And as the child matures, we can be teaching these skills. Jennifer brought up William James. William James wrote a classic 2-volume tome in 1890 called The Principles of Psychology, and he has a chapter on attention in that book. And he said in that chapter, and this is a quote, he said, "The faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will." And he went on to say that an education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. And so I think that there's something really important there, and we need that education of attention in order to be more discerning consumers of social media rather than having the social media consume us.
I just want to be clear, we don't consider ourselves part of social media on our live stream.
But of course not.
Question from Nancy Shonke, and that is, what is the difference between wisdom and selflessness? Jennifer?
Oh, I was hoping we were going to flip-flop, and Richie was going to do that. But I do, first of all, I mean, Richie, do you want to, should we shift?
I mean, I'll be happy to go first. I would say that selflessness is an aspect of wisdom. I think that one of the ways that I described that we think about wisdom is having this deep experiential understanding of how our minds work. One of the key attributes of our mind is that we construct a self. That is something that human minds do. Every one of us has a construction of a self. And when we, for example, have an emotion, we say, "I am sad," or "I am happy." We're attributing that emotion to this entity, this self. And we can ask a question, well, are we really, is every pore of us sad? When we say we're sad, what does that actually mean? Is every cell in your body, is every aspect of your mind sad? What does it mean to say that sentence? That begins a kind of self-inquiry that can help us to better understand how our self actually works. And eventually, it will take us to a place of selflessness, because we actually can experientially recognize that this entity called ourselves is not what it's cracked up to be. It's a lot more, it's like a house of cards. And when we have that experience directly, that is a very important aspect of wisdom.
Interesting.
Thank you. Thank you. If I'd like to just piggyback on Richie's comment. First of all, Nancy, I just want to thank you for your question, because it's one that really is very important in my own research. And the reason why is I'm looking at wisdom in the American context. And what's the American context? The context that, has a sense of the hypertrophied self, American individualism, the sort of exaltation of the self over society. So there's a particular history here that these wisdom claims are taking root at. And so what's interesting, I guess what I would say is this. I like to say that there isn't wisdom without context. So there isn't any sort of idea about the self or no self or the denial of self, or as Richie suggests, interrogating what is it, who's the I, who's the center of this ego, that is received, that's understood very differently depending on who you are and where you are. It seems like an obvious comment, but again, context matters. And so here I'll just give you an example. For me, the literature and wisdom, of which there's a lot about, overcoming the ego, dissolving the ego, the no self, recognizing the way in which identity is a construction. This is really powerful stuff, but it hits differently for many African American readers. Under Jim Crow, when they're told they have no self that's recognized in any meaningful way by the state. So it's harder to hear. Or for second wave feminists who are just, in the 70s, trying to come and assert a sense of who their self is, a sovereign self separate from husbands and dads. So again, I'm not saying that there's anything fundamentally objectionable to selflessness, but it just means that it always depends on who's being confronted with that notion, and what are they up against? What does embracing that necessarily mean? And how is that perhaps warring with other kinds of imperatives, other sorts of, let's say, political claims or economic claims that they want to make? So that's how I would answer that question.
Great, thank you. Question from Mark Olson: how can we quiet our minds in such a distracting world? And I don't know if that distraction refers to the social media we mentioned earlier, or just bigger things than that even.
Yeah, I would say, Mark, first, thank you for asking that. It really is so important in today's world. And I would say that one of the invitations in the kind of message that I'm conveying is that we can harness these moments. They're interstitial moments, you can think of them. So let me give you an example, a very practical example. I always take a few moments before I eat. We all eat several times a day. You can take a few moments and simply appreciate the many people that all were required and have participated in some way in enabling you to have food on the table to eat. And just taking a few moments to quiet and to bring into your mind and your heart these individuals and allow this sense of appreciation to emerge. Those are the kinds of simple moments that we can harness every single day. And we just need to remind ourselves to do it. We often make a commitment, but it quickly fades. And this is why formal practice can be very important. Procedural learning to instill this as a habit that we do every single day, time and time again. So, and then I would, also explicitly encourage taking a few minutes to spend in a quiet way, and you can do a simple mindfulness practice. You can do an appreciation practice. There are many things you can do, but one of the things I often remind people is that when human beings first evolved, none of us were brushing our teeth. I bet you every person who's watching this program brushes their teeth and spends a few minutes a day doing that. We do that because it's important for our physical hygiene. We recognize that. It's not part of our genome. And what we're talking about is something really important for our personal mental hygiene. And I think most viewers of this program, and pardon me if there are any dentists watching, but I think most people would agree that our minds are even more important than our teeth. And if we spend even 3 minutes a day quieting our minds in this way, I have the conviction that this world would really be a different place. So please try it.
Do we keep brushing the teeth, Richie?
Yeah, you can actually do this as you're brushing your teeth. So you don't even have to take a single extra minute if you do it intentionally as you're brushing your teeth.
Viewers are relieved. I like the thought that you gave us about meals and thinking about how many people that took. That's interesting. A question from Greg Shunke. If wisdom is the application of knowledge in decision making, can you apply knowledge apart from a moral base? Jennifer, you want to wade into that one?
Greg, I think I'm going to disappoint you. So, and that is pretty consistently in the material that I read and the historical sources that I read, wisdom is almost always often distinguished from knowledge. So anyway, you raise just an interesting tension there. Does one need knowledge in order to have wisdom? What is the relationship of the two? You do make the important point, though, that it's about how to apply knowledge. So if wisdom is how you apply it, and I think that's the key point. That is to say that knowledge is not a substitute for wisdom. Wisdom is a sort of higher order kind of thinking and moral being. You ask, can you apply it apart from a moral base? Well, again, I suppose it would depend on who you're listening to, but I think the more persuasive authors on this are ones who say that wisdom can never be separated from some sort of moral dimension, from some sort of moral calculus. That if you're doing those same things, but there's not a moral dimension to it, it's not really about helping either oneself or others. And I don't mean helping oneself in a self-serving way, but tending to one's own well-being. Then it's some other species of being. It's not quite wisdom. So maybe it might be therapeutic, and that's important. It might be instrumental in some other way, but it's not necessarily wisdom. So in my reading, again, and this goes across traditions, this goes across philosophical practices, wisdom is always yoked to some sort of moral dimension or moral commitment. Knowledge is the funny thing that can kind of come and go in the equation.
Interesting. Richie, any thoughts on that?
Well, I certainly share completely Jennifer's view that wisdom and taking a moral stance are intimately connected. You cannot have wisdom in the absence of a moral base. And I would also strongly agree that wisdom and knowledge are completely different. I'm reminded of Tibetan peasants that I've met who are completely uneducated. They don't even know how to read, and yet they just exude wisdom. They have virtually nothing, no material possessions, and yet they're utterly content. And they, I think, have a lot to teach us about how to live a meaningful life. And these are extreme cases where you see this radical disjunction between knowledge and wisdom.
One more question I'd like to ask. Richie, I know you spent a lot of time trying to study how these practices can then be found in measurements in the brain and their impact on people. And there've been a lot of studies to look at people's brains and how they're affected in this way. So there's inherently some effort along the lines of measurement as it relates to well-being and the mindfulness practice. And I wonder, is there some such thing with wisdom? Because as you were just talking about these peasants and their wisdom, I take your word for that, but then it sort of begs the question, how do we know someone wise when we meet them? Is it one of those things that's inherently a bit subjective, or is there any effort ongoing to measure it in some way?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. And, the honest answer in time is that we're very far away from, I think, having good objective measures that we think of as measures of wisdom. And so, I think that one of the things that science teaches you, it really forces you to be patient. Progress is slow. It's quite incremental. In our own research, we have identified certain features of brain function do think are fundamentally connected to wisdom, but they're fleeting observations. It would be misleading for me to suggest that these are robust findings at this point in time. But we have some inklings about how this might work. And if we take wisdom, at least in part, to be something like James Meadows said in Jennifer's quote about having that which is obscure become more apparent or understandable, or the ways in which I was talking about it, deeply understanding how our minds actually work and being able to see how our beliefs and expectations, particularly about ourselves, affect our experience of the world. So we have certain features that we can record in the brain that seem to distinguish between people who have this capability and people who don't, or people who have it a lot and people who may have it in a fledgling way, probably is a better way to put it, because we all have this capacity. It just needs to be nurtured in order for it to be strengthened, just like we all have muscles. But some people have muscles that are bigger than others, and that's because they exercise them. And it's the same, I think, with these aspects of wisdom. If we exercise them, particularly in these procedural ways, we can strengthen them. And that will result in changes in these signals that we can measure in the brain.
Fascinating. Jennifer, any thoughts on that?
On just the
measuring wisdom, or
no, that's really not. I would leave that to Richie. I mean, I think all I would say is that it's just interesting to see over the century different efforts to try to demonstrate that wisdom has some objective reality in the world, right. That it's efficacious. And so what are the ways that we typically do that, or what are authoritative ways? It is by oftentimes scientific measures. So there have been wisdom studies, over the course of the 20th century, not a lot, but some. But I think there's others who would want to measure it just in a much more modest way, from person to person. What is the effect of reading that book, and how does that change the way the person thinks about herself or her world? So I tend to look more at those sorts of that kind of efficacy rather than scientific efficacy. But I do think I think efforts to try to measure them are important, because at least it says that it matters. That this is a priority for our culture, that there are resources being put there.
And actually, one piece of real world efficacy that's analogous to what you're describing, Jennifer, which we're also deeply interested in, is how does being in the presence of a person who is considered to be wise actually affect you? And are there sort of common experiences that people report when they're in the presence of individuals who may be broadly acknowledged as wise people? And I think that this is a very different way, but a legitimate way to measure the impact of wisdom.
And I think you have my, where can I write a test and an endorsement of it? Again, because I see this in a narrative way, right? People testifying to this very thing, being in the presence of someone who they think has wisdom, and the somatic experience that one has.
Absolutely.
And we've seen this, in philosophy and psychology and poetry. So not something where it's been measured, but this is a concept, as an idea, as a notion, is really ever present in the literature. So it's got a good reputation, but it just doesn't have any science to back it up. So here we go. I think that would be very, very interesting, because it would pair out a longstanding claim by many wisdom seekers. And that is precisely what you say, just being in the presence of someone who you think has wisdom has a somatic and existential effect.
Well, they should have done the before and after on me, because I feel like this has been just a fantastic discussion. I hope the two of you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed interacting with you, and maybe you ought to continue this conversation. It's very, very interesting. I'd love to have you back sometime. Thank you for taking your time to share your insights with our audience tonight. I hope no one feels robbed by the lack of a mindfulness exercise. Richie, would you like to offer one to us?
Well, we can do a very quick one. I know time is running out, but we can do a really quick one that will also include aspects of insight and wisdom as we talk about it. So let's just take a moment and get settled in our seats or wherever we're sitting. We can close our eyes, since we're spending so much time in front of screens, and find a comfortable but upright posture. And let's just take a couple of deep breaths. And bring our awareness into our bodies. And there's nothing to fix, nothing to change, simply being aware. And this is an invitation to transition from a mode of doing to one of simply being. Now, I invite you to all think about a situation that is present for you. It could be a situation at work. It could be a situation with your family. Not necessarily a difficult situation, but one that has some complexity and challenges. Bring the situation into your mind. And spend a few moments thinking about how your beliefs and your expectations influence your experience of this situation. And can you envision having a different set of beliefs and expectations? And how adopting this different set of beliefs and expectations might change your experience of this situation. So let's spend just another couple of moments considering and reflecting on how our beliefs and our expectations may shape how we experience important events around us. And now let's drop all of this and simply rest. And notice whatever may be occurring in your mind and your body. Again, without attempting to change anything, simply resting with awareness. We can open our eyes and express our appreciation to Mike and his colleagues for the wonderful work that they're doing during this time of the pandemic in bringing the university to all of you. And this is one of the amazing benefits of this crazy time in which we're living. In certain ways, the barriers and boundaries which were previously existing are falling away. And so thank you, Mike. Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you all.
Well, thank you, Richie and Jennifer. It's really our pleasure to bring people like you out to our audience. It's just terrific. So thank you both for taking the time this evening, and thank you for that great closing exercise. That was really powerful.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks to our audience. I hope you enjoyed tonight's program as much as I enjoyed being a part of it. You may have seen a survey for the UW Now Livestream series as we continue to grow this program and think about all the programming at WFAA going forward. Your feedback is really important to us. So if you've already taken it, thank you. If not, you might be receiving yet an invite in the next day or so to participate in that survey. So if you could take a moment and do that, we would certainly appreciate it. Thank you for your time in providing that feedback. We will be back again next Tuesday, January 26th, with another interesting program. We look forward to seeing you again. Thank you, and on Wisconsin.